Clergy sexual misconduct tends to be associated with priests and other church leaders abusing children, particularly the horrifying abuse and cover-ups that have plagued and continue to plague the Catholic Church. However, we've had many painful reminders that patterns of clergy sexual abuse and misconduct are limited neither to the Catholic Church nor to the abuse of children. Courageous individuals such as Lori Ann Thompson and abuse survivors as children and adults from the Southern Baptist Convention. Just last week, Shelley and Peter Taylor bravely shared their testimony at the SBC annual convention in New Orleans as an example. This has expanded the fight against abusive individuals and toxic institutional culture into the arena of abuse against adults. Understanding the similarities between child and adult abuse may help us to understand the power dynamics inherent in abuse, but I believe that understanding the differences is crucial as well. The power dynamic between an adult, especially one with institutional authority, and a child is readily apparent. The dynamics in adult relationships are more nuanced and often require a careful understanding of institutional and interpersonal power. Social science perspectives reflect extensively on the idea that power is much more than physical force or compulsion of any kind. There is positional power, institutional power, power that comes from intellectual ability, verbal acumen, emotional attunement, charisma, power that removes the appearance of choice, power that subtly manipulates. The political and social theorist Stephen Lukes, in discussing the multidimensionality of power, in I think it's a Power, a Radical View is the name of the work, discusses how manipulation and coercion can be used to disorient and shape the very landscape in front of us. So when we explore the ways that those with power can use that power to manipulate, we see more clearly how children are not the only ones vulnerable to abuse. It makes sense then that a lot of the research on adult abuse focuses on the vulnerabilities of those who are abused. Past abuse creates a vulnerability to future abuse. Traumatic and tragic events such as childhood trauma and abuse, severe marital discord, the death or illness of a child, past oppression and mistreatment in the church potentially make one more vulnerable to abusers. And yet I submit that paints an incomplete and potentially even misleading picture of adult abuse survivors. So I want to present two vignettes, and I want us all to think about how the focus on vulnerability colors our image of abuse survivors. Maria is a 33-year-old, timid but friendly married woman with two young children. After leaving her job as a receptionist to stay at home with her children, her household income grew tight and she began to grow more distant from her husband. Her older child began to act out in school and was diagnosed with ADHD. Maria and her husband decided to send the child to a school where he was more likely to get the help he needed. This meant that Maria needed to go back to work. Having never completed her bachelor's degree due to financial constraints, she had trouble finding a flexible, well-paying job and ultimately sought employment at the local church where her family attended a few times a year. The pastor who hired her was kind, caring, and fatherly to her from the beginning, a strong contrast to her actual father, from whom she routinely endured verbal abuse as a child. The pay, he told her, was not very much, but the hours were flexible, and the work was God's work. During Maria's time working at the church, she began to seek the pastor's guidance for her marriage struggles. He listened, gave her advice, often quoting scripture and praying with her, and lavished her with praise for her ability to hold it together as a mother and wife in such difficult circumstances. The second vignette, Natalie. Natalie is a 45-year-old, outgoing and empathetic married woman with 3 children between the ages of 13 and 19. Natalie earned a degree in education and spent a number of years as a school teacher, but fervently committed to her faith, she always wanted to work in ministry and jumped at the opportunity when the church she and her family were actively involved in for over 10 years established a nearby church plant. She was asked by the associate pastor who had left to plant the church if she would join him as the director of youth and family ministry. She happily accepted the role with the support of her husband and subsequently began attending seminary courses in pursuit of a ministry degree and ordination in the church. The families grew closer. The pastor frequently invited Natalie's family over for cookouts and cocktail hour. Natalie was growing in her ability as a minister in the church and functioned as a sounding board for the pastor's administrative and theological ideas. an editor for his sermons and writings, and increasingly as a relational escape from the pressures of a demanding and often unfulfilling home and work life. In both cases, their pastors turned out to be predatory, and they used the context to begin to confuse, disorient, and obscure the boundaries between friend, employer, pastor, confidant, and intimate partner. To be clear, I'm not suggesting in any way that the person in the first vignette should be thought of as the vulnerable victim described in what I'm calling the succumb model here on the screen, any more than the person in the second vignette. Instead, I'm suggesting that because Maria had more contextual factors commonly considered to be vulnerabilities, her story fits more naturally with a vulnerability-centric perception of survivors. To personalize this for me, prior to getting to know so many people in the survivor community, it was easier for me to wrap my mind around targeting, grooming, and abusing as something that, even though I knew it wasn't the survivor's fault, tends to afflict the quote-unquote vulnerable victim. What's worse, the succumb model can even go so far as to suggest the perpetrator's transgression was merely succumbing to her weaknesses, her deficiencies. I'm contrasting this with the perpetrator's as thieves model, in which the perpetrator identifies the strengths and assets of the victim, of the survivor, and seeks to possess and feed off of them. So we just want to point out three problems with the vulnerability model, the succumb model. I believe the focus on victim vulnerability misunderstands the way in which targeting and grooming often works. Much like stranger danger, if you remember from the 80s and 90s, our vulnerable victim model potentially misplaces our focus in a way that fails to properly protect institutions and individuals. Put simply, clergy abusers may be targeting in their victims, quote unquote victims, much of what we typically think of as strengths, not vulnerabilities. Second, we other the abused individual by characterizing them as a vulnerable victim instead of a survivor of targeting. Looking back, I believe I did this to some extent when I first heard the reports of Lori Ann Thompson's abuse, because I wanted to believe, I think, whether subconsciously, perhaps, this was someone else's problem, someone with problems, the type of things that I would never experience because I'm not the vulnerable type. My family's not the vulnerable type. I think we never want to believe that maybe we're the ones who could fall prey, miss the signs, overlook something that seems obvious in hindsight, speaking again personally. That's a scary thing, and it might require a call to action. But I don't think that we can truly support survivors if we see survivors as nothing more than their vulnerabilities. The third problem with the vulnerability model that I want to point out, we know that survivors of trauma and abuse will often seek to explain their unexplainable, intolerable circumstances through self-blame by focusing on or even inventing personal deficiencies and failures. One need only speak with someone who's experienced a miscarriage to know that we can blame ourselves for something that's clearly not our fault. So when a survivor is asked presumptuously about their vulnerabilities, what other damaging relationships did you have in your past? I assume you were abused as a child. What's wrong in your marriage? If it was so bad, why didn't you have the courage to just walk out? Why did you seem confused about what happened? Why did you wait to tell your story? These individuals don't need much convincing that they're the problem. And the best thing they can do is accept blame and disappear, sometimes literally. Nearly all survivors of clergy sexual abuse have had some level of suicidal ideation. One final note on shifting from a deficit focus to an asset focus. I think Diane Langberg is absolutely on the mark when she reminds us that abuse reveals the deficient character of the abuser, not the deficiency of their victim. However, if we identify the problems in the character of the abuser and stop there, we may still lack a survivor-centered approach. The recentering of survivors as valuable and visible is particularly important since they're typically cut off from their church communities and, along with disorientation and self-blame, tend to experience alienation from friends, family, and even from self.